shining light, just when I thought that the night had for you satisfy my soul.
Well, are you all ready to learn some more?
Satisfy my
So there are the cards on the seats. If you have any questions, we got a few last week, which was wonderful, and we will address them all eventually. Also, kind of a heads up, we are watching a video today, and there will be a test. Pay attention. Don't fall asleep. There will be a test. So today we're going to be listening to Dr. Terry Morrison, who is a scientist with Answers in Genesis. This was done in 2005, so most of the stuff still is very applicable, but he does talk about some things. Well, this just happened a few years ago. Well, in 2005, a few years ago. So, but anyway, if we could get the flood video going. All right, enjoy.
In this session, I want to talk to you about Noah's flood washing away millions of years. You know, we look at the world that we live in, and we drive along the freeway and we see road cuts, or we go on a family vacation out to the Grand Canyon and we see those layers there, and we have to ask the question, when and how was all of this formed? How did these layers of rocks get there? Well, the evolutionists have told us that this rock layer represents the history of the development of life on this planet, starting with very simple creatures at the bottom of the rock record, and then as we come up through, we see creatures evolving into different kinds of creatures, and the evolutionists say that this timeline represents about 3.5 billion years. And that is what most people believe today. But is that the correct interpretation of the rocks? And what does Noah's flood have to do with washing away millions of years? Well, Noah's flood is absolutely critical to this question of the history of the earth. And if you study the writings of people who believe in an old earth, most of them ignore the flood. All they look at is Genesis 1 and try to figure out how to fit millions of years into Genesis 1, but they ignore the flood. But the flood is absolutely critical to this question of the age of the earth. So I want to talk to you about the flood, first explaining some of the biblical evidence and then looking at the rocks and the fossils. There are 4 views of the flood that have been held in church history. The first is the historical global catastrophe view. Every one of those words is important. This view says the flood was historical. It happened in time, space, history. It was global. It covered the whole planet, so there was no dry land anywhere when the flood reached its highest point. And it was a catastrophe. It was a flood of unimaginable, catastrophic destruction. Now that view was the universal belief of the church for 18 centuries. But in the early 19th century, when the idea of millions of years was born, that view began to be rejected, and it was replaced by some other views. One view was that the flood was a historical, local catastrophe. It really happened in time-space history, but it was localized in the Mesopotamian valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq. And it was just described in Genesis in exaggerated language. Other people said, no, it was a global flood, and it was historical, but it was a global, tranquil flood. It was so peaceful that it left no geological evidence, and therefore we don't have to try to harmonize the flood with the geological record. Now actually, a global tranquil flood is an oxymoron. As they would say in the South, there ain't no such thing as global tranquil floods. In fact, there's no such thing as a tranquil flood. All floods are destructive. All floods erode material from one place and carry it and deposit it someplace else. A flood that leaves no evidence is really a mythological flood. And so I don't know anyone today who holds to a global tranquil flood. And that leads to the 4th view, and that is the view of liberal theologians that the flood is a myth. If you believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, you can believe in the flood, but it never happened. Just like the ancient Babylonians and the ancient Assyrians and the ancient Egyptians had flood myths, so did the Hebrews. Well, I'm not going to argue for the historicity of the flood tonight, but I want to present to you just a few of the biblical reasons for believing that it was a global catastrophe. First of all, consider the purpose of the flood. The purpose, listen carefully, the purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. The purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. Read the text of Genesis. Genesis 6. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. Verse 13. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. The purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. The purpose was to destroy sinful man and all the land animals, and all the birds, and the earth itself. And only a global flood would fulfill that purpose. If the flood was localized, then it wouldn't kill all the animals and all the birds. The animals and the birds living in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia could care less whether there's a flood in the Middle East. Only a global flood will get all the animals. Secondly, the purpose of the ark. The purpose of the ark was not to save a few animals so Noah could start a farm after the flood. The purpose of the ark is very clearly spelled out in Genesis chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. You shall take with you of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his female, and also of the birds of the sky, by sevens, male and female. Why? To keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. If the flood was local, the ark was completely unnecessary. It was a ridiculous building project for God to give to Noah. All he'd have to do is say, hey, Noah, I'm letting you in on a secret. I'm going to send a flood in your area. Why don't you go on a long vacation to Europe? The animals and the birds have no problem. Animals and birds often sense natural disaster coming, like a forest fire or something. They move out of the danger zone. Even if all of them were killed in the floodplain, in a local flood, animals living outside that would just migrate back in after the flood and repopulate the area. So there'd be no need for a flood. Only a global flood fits the purpose of the ark. Because if it was global, there was no place for any creatures to survive. Then the volume of the ark speaks of a global catastrophe. Oftentimes in children's books, we see pictures of Noah's Ark that look something like this. But we've got to scratch this completely from our mind. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The Bible gives the dimensions of the ark. It was 1.5 football fields long. It was about 2/3 of a football field wide, and it was 4 stories tall. It had the capacity of about 560 railroad stock cars. And no boat, as far as we know, was built this big again until about 1860, although we have record of very large vessels built even before the time of Christ, after the flood. So this was a huge, huge boat. And many people will scoff and say, well, there's no way you could fit all of the animals onto the ark. And when they say this, it just shows that they've never done the very simple mathematics. So let's do a little of it to see just how ridiculous this really was or was not. How many animals were on the ark? Well, we have a few facts to take into account from the Genesis record. It tells us that Noah was to take 2 of each kind and 7 of the clean animals. Now, the word kind is very important. It is not the word species. It is not the word genus or family. It's not one of our modern taxonomical terms, but it is the biblical word kind. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 1, where God created the different plants and animals after their kinds. So he used to take 2 of every kind. Well, how big of a category is this biologically? We don't know for sure the genetic boundaries of the Genesis kind, but we have good reasons to think that the original kind was of the dog kind, involved wolves, had the genetic information for wolves, coyotes, dingoes, jackals, and all the varieties of domestic dogs. So when Noah took 2 of the dogs onto the ark, he didn't have to take 2 poodles, 2 Great Danes, 2 Dachshunds. He took 2 of the dog kind that had the genetic information for producing all of this variety after the flood. So kind was certainly not a smaller category than modern species. But for this examination of this question, we're going to make it as hard as we can for Noah. We're going to say he has to take 2 of every species onto the ark. Well, how many species are there? Well, in classifications, we have mammals. There are approximately 3,700 species of mammals, so we'll put all of those on the ark. Now, he wouldn't take all of them on the ark because some mammals live in the ocean, like dolphins, and they're not bothered by floods. They live in the water all the time. Birds, 8,600 species. We'll put all of those on the ark. But some of the birds could have survived outside. Ducks live on the water, and so they potentially could have survived, but we'll put them all on the ark to make it as difficult for Noah as we can. Reptiles, 6,300 reptiles. We'll put them all on the ark. Amphibians, they spend a lot of time in the water, 2,500 species of amphibians. We'll put them all on the ark. Then the rest of the animals all live in the ocean, or they could survive on floating vegetation or in egg form, and so they wouldn't go on the ark. Noah was not told to take any sea creatures on the ark for obvious reasons. So none of those get counted. Let's total them up then. Most of the creatures of the earth live in the ocean or can survive in water, but Noah would have had to take less than 21,000 creatures on the ark. And then we total that up then. We've got 21,000, 2 of each of those. That's 42,000. We'll throw in 7,800 clean animals. That's probably way more than he would have needed. I think there's probably less than 1,000 clean animals, kinds. But we'll make it as hard as we can for Noah. That's a total of 50,000 animals on the ark. Now remember, we're talking species. Kinds was probably a bigger biological category. Therefore, the number of kinds would be much less than 50,000. But we're making it as tough as we can for Noah. Could we fit all those animals on the ark? Well, the first thing we need to bear in mind is that the average size of animals is about the size of a sheep. Some animals, like giraffe or elephant, are much bigger than that, but a lot of animals are much smaller than a sheep. Then, what about the larger animals? Well, why did Noah take them on the ark? It was so that they could repopulate the earth after the flood. So Noah would not take the largest ones because the largest ones would also be the oldest. This would particularly have bearing related to dinosaurs. He would not take Grandma and Grandpa elephant on the ark because they wouldn't have reproductive potential after the flood. He'd take teenager elephant on the ark. Then the size of the ark is given here in feet. It was given in the Bible in cubits, which is the distance from the tip of the elbow to the top of the hand, roughly 1.5 feet. And so we have the cubic feet. There were 3 levels. That's about capacity of about 560 railroad stock cars. 1 car holds 240 sheep. And you say, now wait a minute, Terry. You're packing those in there pretty tight. Well, let's remember, this was a survival journey. This was not a Caribbean cruise where each sheep gets its own private bathroom and kitchenette. Okay, well, we have 50,000 animals at 240 per stock car. That comes out to 208 stock cars, which is only 36% of the ark's capacity, leaving plenty of room for the plant matter that was also taken on the ark at God's command as food for Noah and his family. So there was plenty of room in the ark. And remember now, we're working with species. This is the worst case scenario. If kind was really a bigger genetic category than species, then the number of kinds on the ark was much less than 50,000. But then people still object and say, now wait a minute, you're not going to get those dinosaurs in the ark. Well, there are several factors to consider here. First of all, many of the dinosaurs were much smaller, even at their full size, than a sheep. And then there's the fact that all of the large dinosaurs started out small. The largest dinosaur egg that we have found is about the size of an English rugby football. And so, again, he would not have taken the big ones. And then the evolutionists are notorious for multiplying the number of species. This happens not only in dinosaur research, but also in the study of human evolution. Almost every fossil find gets a new species name, named often after the person who found them. So these are probably a case of multiplying species where there's really no distinction. Again, we see this diversity among dogs, but they're all the dog kind. And here's an example of the Ceratopsia. This is probably all one kind, and this variation that we see here is actually less than the dog variation we saw in the previous diagram. So creation scientists believe there were probably only about 50 dinosaur kinds, and some of them were small. Well, there's another evidence of the global catastrophe, and that is the character of the flood. Back in the 19th century, when people were saying that the flood was not violent, they said, there's no evidence in the biblical text that it was a violent catastrophe. And when they said this, it just showed that they didn't read the English or the Hebrew very carefully. In Genesis chapter 7, we're told about the source of the water in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month. On the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. So the most well-known source of the water was the floodgates of the sky. The next verse says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And I thought that was all the time that it rained until I heard a paper by a Hebrew Old Testament scholar last year in which he argued, and you can go back to the text and look at this, but he argued from the Hebrew, but I think it's also seems clear from the English, that the reference to the 40 days and 40 nights of rain was the time period until the ark started to float, but that the rain actually continued nonstop up until the 150th day. But in any case, this was not a spring rain to water the garden. This was a rain as an expression of the holy wrath of God. This was monsoon rain, 24 hours a day and night, for at least 40 days, and all over the earth. It would have caused mudslides that would make the California mudslides look like a Sunday school picnic. But then the primary source of water seems to be from the fountains of the great deep bursting open, because they are the first thing mentioned. And this word, or what we have in English, burst open, is actually one Hebrew verb. The fountains of the great deep refer to subterranean waters. The great deep in the Bible usually refers to the ocean. So this is subterranean water coming in to the oceans. And we have lots and lots of subterranean water on the earth today. Most of our drinking water comes from underground water. And there's hot, briny water coming into the ocean floor even today. Now, burst open. This is a Hebrew word that is used several other places in the Old Testament, and it is loaded with geological significance. It is used in the book of Numbers when Korah rebels against Moses' leadership, and God says, I'm going to judge Korah, and I want the people of Israel to move away from Korah and his livestock and his people and his tents. And the scriptures say that the ground opened. It's the same Hebrew verb. And it was a small earthquake, and their tents and livestock and people went into the ground, and then the ground closed. It's the same word that's used in Judges when Samson was thirsty, and the rock split and water came out. It's the same verb that's used in Zechariah 14:4 when it talks about the second coming of the Messiah, and it says that the Lord's foot will touch the Mount of Olives, and the mountain will split in two, and a huge valley will form. So this verb is loaded with geological significance. It's telling us that the crust of the earth began to break apart all over the earth, and water came onto the earth under high pressure. Whenever we have a volcano or an earthquake on the bottom of the ocean today, it sets off tidal waves. These become what are known as tsunamis as they approach a landmass. And they can go for thousands of miles across the ocean floor at speeds up to 600 miles an hour. And when they rise up and reach the land mass, they can carry ships a mile inland and do incredible damage to the land. So we have evidence of violence at the beginning of the flood. But we also see evidence in the recessional phase of the flood. In Genesis 8:3, it says, the waters receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. This adverb steadily is actually two verbs in the Hebrew, and they are two of the most common verbs in the Hebrew. They are the verb to go and the verb to return. So the waters, literally, the waters are receding, going, and returning in Hebrew. This is moving water. As the waters are receding, they're moving. What does moving water do? It carries sediments. And so in the recessional phase of the flood, the waters are going to be moving. Some of the sediments that were deposited in the first half of the flood are going to be moved somewhere else. Psalm 104 also alludes to the flood. Many people say this is a creation passage, this whole psalm, but I don't think so. I think if we look carefully at verses 8 and 9, it is talking about the flood. It says that the mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. If that's referring to the third day of creation when God made dry land, then the flood was a violation of that statement. I think that is a statement about the flood. And it tells us that the land mass, the crust of the earth shifted in the recessional stage of the flood. And so the mountains rose and the valleys sank. Now, if you combine earthquakes and volcanoes, like the earthquake that we saw in Turkey a few years ago, with floods, like the one in Nicaragua a few years ago, you are going to have a catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude. Now look at that water. Wouldn't you like to just take a cup and just scoop in there and get a drink? Why does it look so brown? It looks brown because it's carrying sediments. And if we could do a stop-action cut through that water, we would find that that water is not just carrying microscopic particles of silt and maybe some sand grains. It's carrying boulders. And that house didn't last very long, I'm sure. And so the flood was a violent, violent catastrophe. All of the plant materials ripped up off the land. All the land creatures were drowned in the flood, taken from whatever they were hanging on to. And there was massive, massive erosion and sedimentation going on. Then there's the depth of the flood. The Bible tells us how deep it was in Genesis 7. It says, the waters prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. Now, let's suppose that we're all mountains in here, and let's suppose that this little thing here is like Elijah's jar, or was it Elisha, the jar of oil that never ran out. And I start pouring water on the mountains down here. What's going to happen? Well, the water's just going to pile up on top of their head, isn't it? No. It's water seeks a level plain. It's going to run down the shoulders. And so if I want to cover this mountain, I'm going to have to cover a lot of other mountains. But I'm a mountain too, so I've got to keep pouring to cover me. But we got a problem. The doors in the auditorium here are not watertight. The water's going to leak out the doors. It's going to go down the road to the campground here. And then it's going to go down the roads to Harrison. And so I'm going to have to pour a lot of water just to get this mountain covered. The only way to get all the high mountains under heaven covered is a global flood. Those who believe in a local flood believe that it was in the Mesopotamian valley. And to believe in a local flood, you've got to believe in something like this. Now, this is not an actual photograph. This is an artistic design by one of our artists in our office. No such flood really exists in the world, never has. The only way you could have a flood like this is if God put his hands around all that water and kept it all contained. There's a problem with that view, though. There's nothing in the text of Genesis that says God did any kind of supernatural action like that. On the contrary, the whole text of the flood account is going out of its way to tell us he didn't do anything like that he was destroying the whole world. Then finally, for this discussion, the rainbow promise. In Genesis 9, we have the promise that God will never again send a flood on the earth, and the rainbow is the sign of that promise. This passage is one of those passages that causes me to think, you know, Lord, the Bible is awful long, and it takes a lot to read it. It would help if you'd not repeat yourself, you know. Just put it down once, and then we can get on to the next topic. But if you read this passage, God repeats himself over and over and over again. And that should lead us to a very important Bible study principle. That is, if God repeats himself, you should say, I think he's trying to emphasize something. And who did God make the promise to? He did not make the promise to Noah. He made the promise to Noah and all of his descendants, the animals and all their offspring, the birds and all their offsprings, and he made the promise to the earth itself. If the flood was local, God lied. Because there have been many local floods that have destroyed some animals and some people and some of the earth. But only a global flood fits the rainbow promise. When God said he would never destroy the earth again, that is exactly what he meant. And therefore, every time we see a rainbow, we should remember that God flooded this world with a global flood. It should be a sober reminder to us of a historical event. Now, what would you expect from a global flood that lasted 371 days from the day that Noah got on the ark until the day he and the animals came off the ark, as it's described in Genesis? Well, you should expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers that were once soft sediments laid down by water. And you should expect to find that all over the earth. And that's precisely what we find. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. But that rock layer of fossils is a record of death. The evolutionists tell us that's the evidence of millions of years. So you can't really believe in Noah's flood as a global catastrophe and believe in millions of years at the same time. Because if the evidence is evidence of millions of years, if the rock record is evidence of millions of years, then it can't be evidence of Noah's flood. And if it's evidence of Noah's flood, it can't be evidence of millions of years. Now, there are theologians and Bible scholars out there who believe in both a global flood and millions of years, but they haven't thought the issue through. They're being inconsistent. They don't understand the significance of the geological record. Now, let's look at the geology. And to do that, I want to take you back first to the 19th century to help you understand the geology. And in the early 19th century is when the idea of millions of years was born. Up until that time, the biblical and traditional view, which was defended by a group of men that I studied in my PhD called the scriptural geologists, they believed what had been believed for 18 centuries in the church, and that was that there was a supernatural creation week, SCW, and God created everything in 6 literal days about 6,000 years ago, and that was followed about 1,600 years later by the flood, and then things continued up to P, the present time, and then they believed that there would be a supernatural ending, SE, to the world when Jesus Christ came again. That view was replaced in the early 19th century, first by the catastrophist view. There were 2 very influential men in development of that view, Cuvier and Smith, a Frenchman and an Englishman, respectively. And they believed in a supernatural beginning. They believed in God, but they didn't believe the biblical account of history. And so they imagined that over the course of untold ages, millions of years, every so often there was a regional or global catastrophe that destroyed much of the earth and much of the life on the earth. And then after each catastrophe, God supernaturally created new forms of life to replace the creatures that had died in that catastrophe. And then things went along for long ages, and then there was another regional or global catastrophe. So this was the catastrophist view. And because they viewed these catastrophes as natural, there might be a future catastrophe of this magnitude. And they maybe believed in a natural ending, but their writings don't really indicate what they believed about the future. That view reigned in geology for about 30 years. But by about 1830, it was replaced by the uniformitarian view. And this view said there have been no regional or global catastrophes in Earth history. The processes of geological change have been uniform all throughout history. Now, the uniformitarians maybe believed in a supernatural beginning. Some of them maybe didn't even believe that there was a beginning, believed in an eternal earth. But they didn't talk about that very much. But you see, there are no seas on the line. Earthquake here, a volcano there, a small flood here, just like we see on average during the course of a year today. Those have happened all throughout history. And the uniformitarian view, by about 1840, became the ruling dogma of geology. About 1840 is when geology became a profession. That's about the time that you were able, for the first time in history, to get a degree at the university in geology. And so from that time on, everybody was trained with a uniformitarian view of Earth history. And the journals, the science journals, the geological associations were controlled by this uniformitarian view. Now, I say all that so that you can understand this quote that I'm going to read to you by an evolutionary geologist who died just a few years ago. And I'm quoting from a book in which a few pages before this quote, he actually warned people like me, young Earth creationists, from using anything in his book to support my view. But Dr. Ager is dead now, and so I don't really care what he thinks. And what's truth is truth. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, so I'm going to use it anyway. And he now knows his views are wrong anyway. So he's talking about the stratigraphic record, the nature of the strata. And he's got a chapter in there on the history of the early 19th century in geology, and he makes this statement. As far as I can tell from his writings, he was an atheist until his death. My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into history is that I've been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians, in his mind those were the uniformitarians, who were conditioned by the social and political history of their day more than by observations in the field. Now that is a very significant statement. He's saying, and I think he's right, that the uniformitarians were controlled and influenced in their interpretation of the rocks more by social and political ideas than by the actual rocks themselves. He goes on to say this. In other words, and he's writing to his fellow evolutionary geologists, we have allowed ourselves to be, what's that word? Brainwashed. That's not my word, that's his word. Brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme or what might be termed catastrophic processes. So here's what he's saying. I took geology in high school and I learned it with a uniformitarian perspective. I went to undergraduate. I learned geology from a uniformitarian perspective. I went on to get my PhD, taught by uniformitarian geologists. I went out and looked at the rocks, and I was thinking like a uniformitarian. But Dr. Ager was a world-class geologist. He studied on-location geological formations in over 50 countries. And the more he looked at the rocks, the more he began to say, these rocks are screaming catastrophe. The way I was trained to think in school was wrong. I was brainwashed. The evidence of catastrophe was always there, but I couldn't see it because of this brainwashing. Let me illustrate. What's missing in this picture? What was it originally? I'll give you a moment to think about that, and then we'll have a little quiz. Okay? Was the original picture A? Anybody want to vote for A? Okay? How about B? Was that what the picture was originally? C? Anybody want to vote for that one? Okay? This is what most of you will probably vote for, as my past experience would suggest. Was that it? Yeah. Nope. The answer is nothing is missing. It was drawn that way. Now what happened? I brainwashed you. I brainwashed you by asking a simple question. What's missing? And what I did was I influenced your mind to think something is missing. I got to figure out what's missing. because you asked the question. I brainwashed you. I got you to think the way I wanted you to think. So, we all have the same facts. The evolutionists and the creationist geologists, they have the same Grand Canyon, they have the same fossils, they have the same rock formations, but depending on the starting assumptions will affect not only what you see, but how you interpret what you see. So, Dr. Ager is saying, I was brainwashed with a uniformitarian view, set of assumptions, slow, gradual processes, no catastrophes in Earth history of regional or global magnitude. And so when I went out and looked at the rocks, I couldn't see any evidence of catastrophe. But it was more and more observations of the real world that began to show him that the assumptions were wrong. And so he says, if you go out without ruling out a regional or global catastrophe before you ever look at the evidence, you'll actually see the evidence. Now, these kinds of geologists are called neo-catastrophists. Neo from Latin for new. And they are going back to some of the ideas of the early 19th century catastrophists. Now, the neo-catastrophists are still evolutionists. They still believe in millions of years. So they say, you know, if you look at that bottom layer there, let's say that shale, and if you don't look at it with uniformitarian assumptions, you will see evidence in that rock formation that it was formed catastrophically, rapidly. And then if you look at this next layer, let's say it's sandstone, and you look at it without uniformitarian assumptions, without ruling out catastrophe on a very high level, before you ever look at the rocks, you'll actually see evidence in the rock layers that they were laid down catastrophically, rapidly. And if you look at the next layer, the same will be the case. And so they see this evidence of catastrophe. Dr. Ager said that much of the geological record shows evidence of catastrophic formation, but he still believes in the millions of years. So where do they put the time? In between the layers, where there is no evidence. That's convenient. Now, the creationist geologists come along and say, now, you neo-catastrophists are on the right track. There is evidence in those layers that they were formed catastrophically and rapidly. But if you didn't start, you neo-catastrophists, if you didn't start with the anti-biblical assumption that ruled out a global flood before you ever started to look at the evidence, and if you looked more carefully at that boundary, you would see that there's no evidence of long passages of millions or thousands of years. There's evidence that this was laid down in rapid succession. Let me give you just one example. Here is a cross-section of the southwest United States where the Grand Canyon is located. Here's the Grand Canyon, and when you stand at the Grand Canyon, you see those rock layers on the other side, and they look just like pancakes. And we can trace those rock layers for hundreds, in some cases thousands of miles, and they're just as flat as pancakes. But look at the topography of the southwest United States. We see not only this huge canyon, which is 4 to 18 miles wide and 270 miles long and a mile deep, but we see these other erosional features that look like the ancient shorelines of a huge lake or ocean. But look at those layers in the canyon. We don't see any of those features, which we would expect to see if there was a long passage of time. Now, how long does it take to make fossils? Let's talk about that for a moment. Here's an interesting statement from some evolutionists, no friends of creation or the Bible. They say in a book on dinosaurs, fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. Now, stop right there and think. One of the things you have to do as you read what evolutionists say is you need to read the sentence and then you need to back up and read it again more slowly. How do they know that fossilization can take millions of years? Has any geologist lived long enough to observe that as empirical observational science? Well, of course not. Has the science of geology been in existence long enough that you could string together overlapping careers of scientists so they could all share their notebooks and say, we've observed empirically that it takes millions of years for a fossil to form? No, the science of geology has only been in existence about 200 years. So how do they know it takes millions of years for fossilization to happen? The answer is they don't. It's an assumption. It's a belief. Well, how do they know it takes a few hours? Now we're on to empirical observational science. They go on to say, the amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized within a matter of weeks. Well, now Noah's flood was 4,000 years ago. And what would we have with Noah's flood? We would have groundwater heavily laden with minerals as the land is being ripped up and pulverized. We need to understand that fossils do not come with labels on them saying how old they are. The scientists have to infer that from other evidence. But there's lots of evidence in the fossil record that fossils form rapidly. Here is some interesting evidence. An ichthyosaur fossilized in the act of giving birth. This creature was swimming along and didn't know it, but a wave was coming along in the ocean, choked with sediments, buried this creature alive, cut it off from scavengers, micro-decay organisms, and those sediments were quickly turned to stone. Or look at the fish caught in the act of eating its lunch. Fish decompose very rapidly, and yet we find many, many examples of fish not only preserved in the skeletal form, but even the soft parts, the fins, are preserved. This speaks of very rapid burial. Or consider jellyfish. I mean, they don't have any hard parts at all. And when jellyfish are in storms, they will often be washed up onto the shore. And when they're washed up onto the shore, they are in a fight for survival. And they start pumping on the sand to try to get ready for the next wave that will wash up so that they can go back into the ocean. A couple of years ago, geologists found a formation in Wisconsin that had thousands of jellyfish fossils in the layers, along with these ripple marks, both very transitory features. And they look just exactly like the impressions that are made by modern jellyfish pumping on a beach to survive. This speaks of rapid burial and rapid fossilization. We also see evidence of fossil graveyards. For example, the Karoo Formation in Africa, where 800 billion vertebrates estimated are buried together, all messed up. This is not where they lived. This is where they were buried. Or consider the formation in Florissant, Colorado. Shell creatures, some fish and birds, and hundreds of species of plants and insects are all buried together in one location. They didn't all live together when they were alive, but they're buried together. And then there's the formation in Agate Springs, Nebraska, which is what this picture is from. And here we find thousands of fossils of rhinoceros, camels, giant boars, and other exotic animals, none of which live in Nebraska today, and they're all mixed together. They're not buried where they lived, they're buried where they're buried. And they're not buried where they just fell over and expired and died. Some catastrophe mingled all these bones together.
Sorry about the sound. I don't know what the deal was of why it kept fading out, but it is what it is. So, okay, quiz time. You were paying attention, right? You listened real closely and you kept track of everything that was told. So according to the video, how many animals did Moses take on the ark? What? None. Moses did not take any animals on the ark. Good job. You were paying attention. See, it's not only in what you're hearing, but it's also what the questions are. So yes, it was around 50, at the most, is what the speculation is, around 50,000 animals. So, and 560 railroad cars, I mean, that's a lot. And the other thing to remember, too, is he was saying that they would take the very small ones, and the eggs, even of dinosaurs, of large animals, could not be very big, because there comes a point that the eggshell has to be permeable enough that they can actually breathe through it. And if it gets too big, then they can't breathe. And then if it gets too small, it'll just fall in on itself. So there is some idea that it's very obvious that there's only a certain amount of space, of size that it could actually get. But I want to talk a little bit about the flood itself. So we have a couple of numbers that were given to us. He said there was 371 days that they were on the ark. Okay, give or take. There's some questions on exactly how many days there really was, because calendars and this, that, and the other, we don't always know. But there was, go that way. You went too far. So now you should be able to hit forward there. Okay, so the first thing that we have is that we're told, and this is not, I don't think this was included in his 371, but Noah and the family was told to go onto the ark 7 days before God shut the door. And we don't know why they were on the ark for 7 days and nothing was happening. There's a lot of speculation as to what could happen. It was 7 days was a time of mourning. So whether it was mourning for what was about ready to happen of all the people that were going to die, or if somebody in their family had recently died. Don't know. There's a lot of speculation. So after the 7 days, then we're told that it rained for 40 days. Okay, so rain is on the earth, rain is coming down, and that's also when there started to be the fountains of the deep, whatever that really was. Earthquakes, tsunamis, whatever. So then after the 40 days, then we have, you remember? $110 days. I'm a visual person. I learn by seeing. So, Brian, you need to come to this end. Okay, so after the 110 days, then we have the waters abated for 74 days. And remember what he said that meant? The waters were going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. The other thing we have to think about and remember, what causes your tidal waves today? What? The moon circling the earth causes the waves to come back and forth. Okay, what stops the waves? Land. So as the waves are coming in, they hit the land and then they stop. Okay, now we have this earth that's totally covered with water. The moon's still going around. So there's still waves coming back and forth, but now there's no land to stop it. So every 24 hours, you're on the boat. Okay, get ready, here it comes. But because there's nothing to stop it, the next day it's a boom. And it gets bigger and bigger because there's nothing stopping it. And again, speculation, don't really know, but it makes sense. Okay, so then, after the 74 days, 40 days after that, Noah put out a raven to see what's going on. And the raven came back with nothing. You good? So he did that, and then he waited another 7 days, and he sent out a dove. And then it came back. He waited another 7 days, and then the dove came back, and he had a leaf, olive branch. And then he waited another 7 days, and then it didn't come back. In my mind, I always thought that was the end of it. But no, he waited another 29 days, and he took the covering off the ark. So they knew there was land out there. That's why they sent out the birds. The one didn't come back, so he goes, okay, he's found a place to nest. But they waited another 29 days. They took off the cover. And then 57 days later, God told Noah it was time to leave the ark. So my helper is working on getting all of our timeline here. I mean, this is a lot of time that they were on the ark. So, you have the clicker? Oh, here it is. Yeah. Need to go back. Technology, ain't it great? Nope. Anyway, I had a nice illustration of all these days, all these numbers, and that's how I got the 378. So I went off of kind of his 371, but I added the 7 days at the beginning to make the total amount of time. Can you think back 378 days? So a year ago in July, I mean, that's a long time. And they're contained in this boat, taking care of these animals. Now, they didn't have a whole lot else to do, but, you know, that's a long time. Oh, here's my nice illustration. You're still working on getting the numbers? So, anyway, I will finish making my chain and let Ryan talk about the next part.
Hello. Oh, there we are. So, some things we want to touch on. One thing is, I made a comment last week that during the flood there would have been about 7 large tsunamis that hit the world as it's being flooded. And it's okay, where did I get that information from? Well, Dr. Tim Clary is a geologist, and he wrote a book called Carved in Stone. Now, I'm going to put a caveat here. Geologists, the field of geology is one of the most ambiguous fields of the sciences. Why? Because you cannot take something, say, how did this get here, run an experiment, and say, aha, that's how it happened. Most scientists, they can do that. They can do some sort of experimentation and get the results. Geology is, well, here's a canyon. I think water did it. Do we know that water did it? No. The only way we can know is when something happens on the earth and we get a canyon that looks like this canyon and go, okay, maybe that's also how this canyon was formed. So I say that, and I'm not referring to just evolutionary geologists, I mean all geologists. They work on a lot of assumptions. And I will say geology is weirdly also, they are the most adamant that their assumption is the right assumption. So, I point to Tim because he was actually, before he started getting into the creation field, he was a geologist for deep oil drilling. And you see what that meant is that Tim had a lot of data that most geologists were just guessing at. he had deep core information. He knew what the rock layers were miles down. Most geologists are just assuming, they're just guessing based on their model, this is what we think we'll find. So, what Tim has actually been doing over the past decade or so is he has been going to every single continent and he has been getting hundreds or thousands of core samples, and he is actually mapping out the rock layers. And it is in his assumption, based upon how the rock layers were laid down, that there were about 7 different giant, waves coming in, laying down sediment, and then it recedes, and then another layer comes in, and this time this layer, it goes further inland, and then it recedes, and then it goes further inland and recedes. And what you find is that the closer you get to the center of the continents, the less rock layers you tend to have, implying that there were fewer of these waves that hit it. So, I say that I'm quoting him because Tim and a few other geologists in his field are one of the few geologists that I would say are using data-driven hypothesis, not just going out saying, yep, there's a bunch of rocks here, obviously this was caused by a volcano. They're actually trying to use data to create that field. Now also, both in reference in this video and me last week, talked about the destruction of the plant life of the earth, and that when Noah landed, there probably was not much in the way of large trees to be making houses and buildings and rebuilding society, which also probably means that for at least until the trees grew big, they started galvanizing the ark, because the ark would have been their main source of wood, which is why we will probably never find the ark, because it got turned into a bunch of buildings. But I say this because if you look at the destruction of all of this here, that's what we see today in minor floods and tsunamis. Okay? This is minor destruction. What do we think would happen after a year of water just destroying the earth? And again, this water probably didn't even reach the top of these trees. And it was still destructive enough to push them over. Now imagine water strong enough that did reach the top of these trees and probably several hundred feet taller than the trees. The trees don't stand a chance. Now, as a final point, he made the comment that fossils do not come with dates on them. Well, that's actually not quite true anymore. The Creation Research Society started what was called the iDino Project, and what happened was, in 2008, a doctor by the name of Mary Schweitzer was looking at a T-Rex fossil, and she went, those look like blood vessels. And sure enough, she didn't believe it at first. She thought it was some sort of contamination because she's an evolutionist. This T-Rex fossil is, 90 to 110 million years old. Blood vessels can't survive that long. So she did the test dozens of times until eventually she came to the conclusion, yeah, there is organic material in these fossils. So what we at the Creation Research Society did is we got a Triceratops horn, we broke it open, and we went, yeah, we're finding soft tissue in this. And then later on, we got a dinosaur vertebrate, and not only did we find cells, oh, this is the video part. What we found was that's meat. Okay. This is organic tissue. Sorry, that's the video. That's good, thank you. So this is not, you can't say, oh, well, a bug crawled in there and died, and that's the organic material that you're finding in the fossil. No, you could physically cook and eat that. I would not recommend it, but you could. Okay, and the importance for this and the reason for this is because, look, we know organic material doesn't last hundreds of millions of years. Now, the evolutionists, of course, they are backpedaling and they're, giving all sorts of theories and possibilities and all kinds of methods, and that's one thing that we at the society right now are working on, is testing and, saying, no, these don't happen. But in the words of my late father, can we go back to the slides? If dinosaur fossils have been misdated, then all the fossils have been misdated. If all the fossils have been misdated, then all the rocks have been misdated, and their entire geologic timescale comes crashing down. Okay. In fact, if you look in the Encyclopedia Britannica and you go to rock layers, they will tell you one of the main ways that they date the rock layers is based upon the fossils that they find in the rock layers. Okay. Now, if you go to fossil dating methods in the same encyclopedia, it will tell you how they date fossils is upon which rock layers they're found in. And again, this comes back to the preconceived notions. They know the Earth is 2.5 billion years old. Therefore, we know these rocks are hundreds, if not billions of years old. And because we know that, all this other evidence is just, well, we just haven't found the explanation for it yet. So, that's all we've got for you today. Next week, we get to do astronomy. And that is going to be a fun topic, because there are a lot of questions people have when it comes to astronomy. So, thank you so much for coming. Again, if you had any questions, you thought of anything, feel free to come get us. If we don't answer them in the next following weeks, we're going to save them all for week 6, where we're going to have Dr. Joseph Gazelle come, and we're going to send this out to other people and have their responses as well. So, thank you very much.